before anything, I do want to wish everyone a happy holidays because by the time I've uploaded this video, it would be the 24th, so it'd be like Christmas Eve, I think. So happy holidays if you celebrate those, I guess. It was probably almost 2 years ago. Well, it'll be 2 years ago by the time 2025 hits, when I got unsolicited advice about same-face syndrome, because at the time, my art style was a little bit different than it is now, and by that I mean there was some pieces of it that would become integrated into my current art style, and I was definitely trying out a lot of stuff, but it was very different features-wise. And so I got a comment one time that was like, "Oh, this is really cute, but you have same-face syndrome," and that shocked me really bad, mostly because I didn't notice it, but once it was pointed out, oh boy, and even like looking back at that post that comment was made on, yeah, it's a lot more obvious than I think it was originally for me. And before I say like anything and get into this advice also, there's a difference between having an art style and having same-face syndrome. So I'll see a lot of people tend to say that, oh, this person has same-face syndrome, but that's more or less, like, most of the time an art style thing rather than it being, actual same-face syndrome. However, I do think in a lot of cases, there's just a lot of times where people just don't know how to diversify features within the confines of their art style, so that can be a little bit difficult for some, especially when it comes to, like, anime art style based stuff generally. There is a lack of like differentiating features besides just the eyes, like the nose, mouth, facial structures. Those aren't really integrated into those art styles, so not entirely a bad thing. And I don't think same-face syndrome is a bad thing or that it's really an issue. It does create some distance with representation of different like diverse facial features, which is an issue depending on who you're asking. But regardless, I'm just gonna get into my personal experiences and what worked for me and what didn't. So I think one of the things that I started to do after finding out about that was different types of eyes, noses, and chins, essentially. So I think there's a lot of things that you can do that are really simple to make faces look different, like distances in eyes, how far away and proportioning you're doing with like all of the face. I didn't realize I loved doing like long faces and really squished round faces until I started messing around with that a lot more. And I think just kind of exploring those options, and then when you're ready, kind of diving into different noses and facial features that you're not used to drawing, can be helpful, because there's very subtle things that you can do to make faces look different. I think one of the things that I do a lot with my characters and just making them look a little bit different besides, the obvious nose and chins, is the way I'm doing eyes, because there's some eyes that I think I do a lot more upturned, downturned, wider, or smaller. There's also a lot of things I think in that regard that you can do. While I do think learning different types of eyes is really helpful, sometimes it's not as obvious, and if you are just doing eyes alone and not changing any other facial features, then it does kind of like not really work in that end. But those are just some things that worked out for me. Looking at different references also, and seeing what other artists do with their facial features, and then try and figure out a way to adhesively nudge that into my art style. So again, there is a lot of really cool things that you can do, and it is going to take some time and practice, because as soon as I started like integrating actual noses into my art style, there was a lot more things that I could do in that sense. So yeah, I think it's also important to note what didn't really work, especially when I was starting to figure out what was, good ideas and what wasn't. And around this time when I was trying to figure out what to do with my art style and make it less same-face syndrome, I posted a little slideshow of me trying to figure out how to do this with keeping my art style consistent. And I look back at it and I'm like, no, that's not the way you do it. And by that I mean the only thing I was changing was the eyes. And again, I think I talked about this a little bit earlier. Changing just the eyes isn't going to do a lot when it comes to the rest of the face, because when you overlap all of those faces, they look essentially the same. There's very little distance between the proportions and whatever. So while I was doing different things, it just wasn't working in diversifying the facial features. So I don't think that was my best moment. And I think that was like one of the few things that just didn't really work. However, as soon as I started moving those around, like moving the eyes farther apart, higher up, lower down, that started to make a little bit of a difference. So it's not necessarily the issues with eyes, but it's important to note like spacing, I guess. Again, very important. At least it worked out for me. So now that that's all out of the way, I do want to talk about the best point of advice that I received on one of these slideshows that I did. And it stuck with me ever since. And I think it's really important to note if you are thinking about diversifying your facial features in your art style. And that was to draw people that you don't find like conventionally attractive, or just draw people that you don't always find attractive. Because even though it's like a little bit awkward, and I think a lot of people lean towards just drawing people that they find attractive or features that they draw attractive consistently, it's also really important to expand your options, because I feel like after hearing that point of advice, I was definitely exploring a lot more options that I wouldn't have had I not gotten that point of advice. And in that regard, there's a lot of things that I found really cool to draw after exploring a lot more. And one of the things that I think I still need to do a lot of more work on, but I think has been really awesome to draw as of late, is wrinkles. And I don't necessarily show the speed paints for those because I know that people like aren't too fond of wrinkle speed paints, and you know, but they've become one of my favorite things to draw because there's just so much you can do with rendering and shading and everything. And yeah. And I also think one of the things that I didn't originally enjoy drawing but have come to love all the same is also drawing bigger noses, or just noses as a whole, different types of noses, because there's just so much you can do with a nose. And in my original art style, at the time when I was dealing with same face syndrome, I hadn't really integrated that part into my art style. And I'm so glad that I have, because it's made such a difference. Draw people that you don't always find attractive, and I think that will diversify your OC's facial features a lot more. And yeah, I do hope these were helpful. And again, this is mostly just like my own personal experience, so you know, I'd love to hear other people's thoughts and what they might have done to make or break their same face syndrome. And again, I don't see same face syndrome as an issue, but you know, it does lack representation in that regard. And if you are leaning towards wanting to represent more people, it's important to note, because there's so many different really cool features people have that aren't really like drawn a lot, at least in mainstream media, so it's always fun to explore. And while I'm not exactly out of the same face syndrome yet, I've gotten to the point where people's facial features tend to overlap again, so you know, it's not 100% for me and I'm still learning. It's just cool. So yeah, that's all. Bye!